much. I see what you mean by these lights, they're pretty blinding. So, let's get the show on the road, and it's me. So there are going to be 3 speakers today. I'm going to start off giving you a review of what the committee's been up to. Cordial is then going to take over on the Scope 1 and 2 initiatives that we've had this year. And finally, Chima is going to join us by video link from Brussels to give us an update on her activity on safe and sustainable by design. So I think these terms are all familiar to you from the different talks. So, first of all, get myself coordinated. Wanted to give you a reminder of the Charter. I think most of you know what the Charter is about, priorities we decided last time, and the work plan. Then I want to go into EcoVadis scoring, because I think this is still a pretty relevant metric for us. And then what do we actually do in 2024? Carbon footprint, deforestation, IFRA-UEBT program, the Green Chemistry Compass, which has been referred to, and we've been working on the webinars and the Toolbox program, updating the Toolbox. I'm not going to say anything more about the Toolbox, but it will be updated for 2025. So, first of all, the Charter. Who signed the Charter? The number has actually increased very slightly this year, so we're now up to 143 signatures of the Charter. I would say we've got one kind of grey zone, well, a lot of grey zones up there, but one particularly large grey zone called China. So China's the one area we still really haven't managed to penetrate in terms of getting signatory companies. But other than that, whether it go from Latin America through to Japan, we really have quite a large number of signatures. And something I've noticed actually is when I go on the websites of many of the companies these days, I've been looking for data from various companies, I see more and more companies actually refer to the fact that they have signed the Charter. So I think that's an encouraging step. And I'm not shouting loud enough? Okay. Next, the reminder of the Charter, the 5 pillars that we have: responsible sourcing, environmental footprint, safe and attractive workplace, product safety, and traceability. What I've highlighted in blue are the areas that we've been spending more time on in the last year, 2024. Responsible sourcing, the labor practices has come into the work with UEBT, deforestation is in there as well. Environmental footprint, we're going to have a session on greenhouse gas emissions later, the circular economy with SSBD, and again, green chemistry, of course, and then item number 4, the SSBD specifically. So, next slide is just to remind you, this hasn't updated. These were the priorities that we defined as a committee when we asked all the committee members to vote on what do they see as most important. This is what came out. As we know, environmental footprinting is one of the biggest topics, carbon, water in the future, and then responsible sourcing as the second big topic that we want to work on in 2024, and we will soon be defining what we do for 2025. So don't worry, you don't have to be able to read this, you're not meant to be able to read this, it's just to say we did have a plan, and we pretty much followed it. So take your binoculars out if you want to look in detail, but basically that's the plan that we've worked to this year. So now I'm going to move on to EcoVadis. Why is EcoVadis good? Well, it's good or not good, it depends how you see it, but I think it's good because it's the broadest measure of sustainability that is widely used. So it covers the 4 pillars, it covers environment, labor practices, ethics, and responsible purchasing. So these are the 4 pillars that you're judged on to get your EcoVadis score. I've updated the slide to 2023. What you can see again is that the leading members of our industry have been following EcoVadis for many years. Their score's pretty high, it remains pretty high, up at 77. And then if you like to say the next tier almost of companies of IFRA-IOFI members typically started a little bit later, but you see their score is improving quite considerably year on year. We're both now in the gold box because actually the standards for EcoVadis keep on increasing. But gold means we're in the top 5% of all the industries that subject themselves to EcoVadis rating. So it's a pretty good rating. The other thing you notice, and there's going to be an echo of this later in the presentations today, is that the leading companies are in quite a narrow band. It's this plus or minus 5. And then when you get to the next group of companies, the range is much larger. So some of the smaller companies have got really high EcoVadis scores, and some of them have got much lower EcoVadis scores. So you just get that range within the companies. The other thing you notice here, I said 7 to 15, it's because there were 7 in 2019 and 15 in 2023. So I think it also gives you an idea how EcoVadis is really being adopted more and more widely by companies across the world. So next topic, to move on then to 2024 activities, and I'm going to start with carbon footprint. So this is one that you perhaps, I need to go back, I think. Sorry, no I don't, I'm getting ahead of myself, don't worry. Carbon footprint, first concern of the industry, of the members when we had the survey, that was what they talked about first, carbon footprinting. We know it's a key concern not just for us, but also for our customers. We've done the scope 1 and 2 that you're going to hear about, and IOFI did a scope 3. So we're going to look very quickly at what IOFI has done as well. This is the updated graphic from last year, which some of you who were there last year may have remembered, where we look at the different company sectors, and then, so home and personal care, fine fragrance, food, this is IFRA-IOFI, and then the fragrance and flavor companies. There have been some changes. A number of companies have been revising their objectives for scope 1 and 2 and scope 3. And what generally we see is a tightening band. For scope 1 and 2, more and more companies are axing towards this 50% reduction by 2030. And for scope 3, again, tightening band, more and more companies heading for minus 30% by 2030. And that, I can assure you, is really challenging. What's driving that is the 1.5 degree commitment. That's why, that's where these numbers are coming from. How do they get to the 1.5 degrees maximum increase in temperature? We heard it in the last panel. Scope 3 is by far the lion's share of our footprint. And the only way that we can get to the minus 30% in scope 3, it's been said before on the earlier panel, is to reduce volume. There is no other solution. We can change the sourcing of raw materials, it will help. Many things can help, but to get to minus 30%, fundamentally, you've got to sell less material. It's the only way it can happen. And Phil, we had a conversation over lunch. I think P&G is the beautiful example because they kind of control the whole supply chain. But I confirm our biggest issue is getting our customers to accept to take a more concentrated, lower volume fragrance. So, this is now moving on to the IFRA Scope 3 project. Cordial is going to cover the Scope 1 and 2. This is the IOFI Scope 3. Sorry, give myself right. So what we're talking here about is raw material production, the 90% if you want. So it's all about how do you produce or manufacture the raw material. So it can be growing it, depending on where it's sourced from, or it's the fossil sourcing. Is it anything to do with the production process, and then typically bringing it to the gate of where you're going to sell it. So they've used the PEF protocol. There are various ways of estimating the carbon footprint. PEF is one, we've had a reference, TFS is another. They followed PEF. It's still the one which is largely used inside the European Commission, although various companies adopt different standards. So what they've been doing is working on 180 key ingredients for the flavor industry, and they boxed them into these 4, which would also be true, I think, largely for fragrances as well. These chemical derivatives is the top box. Things like synthetic vanillin would be in that box. The non-flavoring components, for flavors, that would be things like starch. Flavoring components, natural complex substances, orange oil, whatever. And then bulk, these tend to be the solvents. So like fragrance, flavors also have a significant volume and solvent. And on the right-hand side, for some of them, they were able to get direct data. So a company who was manufacturing the material could provide the data. For some of them, you have to do what's called proxy, where you find something which is rather similar, produced in the main way that you can then read across, if you want to use that phrase, to get the value. And some of them, they have to start from scratch. So they've worked on 180 key ingredients. Where are they right now? They have collected the data. In fact, all the data is in. For their phase 1 and phase 2, they did basically a block of 80 and a block of 80 or so. I think if you look at the flavor and the perfume and flavors, you see that they've just launched the consultation process to get feedback from the community on what they've done. Once that's been completed, they will then end up publishing the results. Exactly how that's going to happen, I know Sven and company are still working through, but that's the process where they're at. That's all I was going to say about carbon footprinting. I'm now going to move on to the deforestation topic. So, second topic, so we had carbon footprint as the first topic, deforestation as the second. As soon as you mention the word deforestation, what comes to mind? Palm. That's the number one concern basically around the world when it comes to deforestation, at least concerning us. And for us, RSPO mass balance is a key measure of are we purchasing palm in a sustainable way or a more sustainable way. What hit us in 2024, a little bit, we probably should have seen it coming earlier, but we didn't, that's life, is EUDR. I'll get into a little bit more in detail into that in the next slides. We also have activities with the SVI, Sustainable Vanilla Initiative, and within the IFRA UEBT, one of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we looked at was also linked to deforestation, but it was not the primary one that we focused on this time. So this again is the map of, next slide on. This is the map of where we are as an industry. So this is the ratio of mass balance to all palm purchased. And again, updated for 2023, and you see we're now at 50%. We're actually probably never going to get to 100% because I don't think today you can actually purchase every palm derivative as mass balanced, but there's still some upside in mass balance. It's going to stay important, RSPO mass balance, even with EUDR, because this covers every palm derivative. So that's why it will remain important. So now a word about EUDR. Everybody expected it to come into force in January 2025. A lot of companies complained, countries complained. So countries in Europe, countries out of Europe complained that they would not be able to meet the deadline in time. So now there's a recommendation to delay by 1 year, which everybody imagines will be accepted. So we're now looking at a delay of 1 year. So it's now going to be effective January 2026. 7 commodities, the same 7 commodities that come up everywhere, pretty much, in CDP and elsewhere. And what's critical is Annex 1, because Annex 1 tells you which customs codes are concerned by EUDR. And basically, as IFRA-IOFI, we've got 2 concerns. One is direct, because there are some materials covered by the Annex which we use per se. So an example would be isopropyl myristate. That's covered by Annex 1. We buy and use that directly. And the second would be indirect, where it's not in scope, but we or our suppliers buy a material that is in scope and then transform it in Europe into a material that we use. So the example that I give down there, that is coffee beans and cocoa beans. We don't put that into fragrance right now, as far as I know, not even when it's ground up. But what people do is import coffee beans and cocoa beans and then extract them in Europe, and we buy the extract. But if they're not able to import the beans, then they cannot do the extraction, then we're missing the raw material. So you have the two types of scope. So what do we do? So this is the team that was working on this. We pooled a list of materials from which we believed could be in scope, and then with the support of the IFRA-IOFI team, we went through that list to identify which materials actually are in scope to the best of our knowledge. So that list is 65 materials. It sounds a very long and frightening list. If your company is any like our company, you have a few which are really quite significant in volume, and then a long list which have got almost negligible volume. So, and I think actually flavors is more impacted than fragrances with this legislation from what I can see. We have the consolidated list. The plan now is to go to some of the relevant bodies in the EU to kind of check it off with them to confirm our interpretation is aligned with their interpretation and we're focusing on the right materials. So what's next on deforestation? It's the SVI, Sustainable Vanilla Initiative. So a lot of IFRA-IOFI members are also members of the SVI, Sustainable Vanilla Initiative. It's historically had a focus on traceability, farming practices, child labor, and living income. They're having a bit of a refocus right now, and this is what I put down here is the kind of new items on their radar. They're going to decide on that in the coming months. but they want to go back now and look at deforestation again for vanilla. It kind of came off the table and has come back on the table. Why is it back on the table? Because the price of vanilla has collapsed, and so farmers are changing vanilla to other crops. What you need to grow vanilla, you need canopy. So if you move from vanilla to something else, you clear the canopy to plant rice or whatever it is they're going to plant next. Compliance, they have also an issue specifically on vanilla with contamination, which we won't go into, and communication, because SVI historically has communicated almost nothing to the outside world. So I think they plan to change that and become a bit more active in terms of their communication. So finally, on deforestation, the IFRA UEBT initiative, a new initiative this year. And the idea here, everybody knows, I think, in the room that we've had one or two events. We had events in Turkey, we had events in Egypt, and I think this has stimulated everybody to work together a little bit more closely on identifying vulnerable supply chains before somebody else does it for us and forces us into expensive coalitions. So the idea is that we try to identify these vulnerable supply chains and to see what we can do collectively, proactively, in a non-competitive way. The two supply chains that we looked at this year were jasmine, Egyptian jasmine, and Bulgarian rose, but as there already is multiple actions on Egyptian jasmine right now, we decided they didn't need an extra one. So I think probably everybody's grateful for that who's actually in the fields in Egypt. But Bulgarian rose is the one that we did look in more detail, and again, I don't know how familiar many of you are with the issues there, but it's largely linked to the Roma population in Bulgaria and the way of life, many aspects around the Roma. So this is actually no longer up to date because the proposal from UEBT of what we can do has landed. So we will be discussing that shortly. And the idea is this IFRA UEBT committee will look at a vulnerable supply chain, identify what can be done, and then there'll be some kind of action plan, and then that's open to new membership of people who want to participate in that action plan to address the issues. Looking to 2025, we're going to look at some points linked to CITES. We're going to look at risk mapping in China, because that's one of the topics which we feel uncomfortable about, and there are quite a lot of naturals and various materials coming out of China, and no doubt we will identify an additional supply chain to look at. I'm going to move on swiftly because I see the clock is ticking, but I'm not doing too badly. I missed the slides. Green Chemistry Compass. So we talked about green chemistry before. Green chemistry, why is it important? Well, it's important for many things, but including it's one way to reduce carbon footprint. If you look at the practices, the principles of green chemistry, it is a way to reduce carbon footprint. The issue historically is that given the 12 directions, companies have been or can be accused of greenwashing because they kind of pick on one and say, look, I'm doing brilliantly on 1 out of 12, and conveniently don't mention the other 11. And so what we were trying to do here was to come across a broad base, looking at all of the principles to say, what can we do? What is best practice for our industry? And I think that's the other important point here. We reduced it to practice for the industry. And we had these three categories: most preferred, needs improvement, and least preferred. And as mentioned by Martina, published now out there. And here's an example. If I move page on. Here's an example of the 12 principles along the top of this slide. There were 3 that we didn't consider because they either overlapped with something else or were not particularly relevant for our activities. And here, for a particular question here, question 1, which is linked to item 7, use of renewable materials, use of renewable feedstocks, you see how we defined the 3 groups. And you see we included, even include biomass balance in there. I can see a little smile from Felix. So that's looking to the future, which is not in the original green principles because biomass balance didn't exist when they were written. So again, I think it's also good to see that you can look at what they did and update it with how science has moved on and evolved in the past. The idea here is not to say that supplier 1 is better than supplier 2. The idea here is that any supplier, a small one or a big one, can use these principles, look at how they are manufacturing a product, and say, okay, given these principles, is there an area where I could improve? That's the aim of this. It's not, as I say, it's not about one is better than another. Finally, webinars. So we do regular webinars through the year. So inevitably, quite a few have been focused on carbon footprint and linked to that aspect this year because that's been a big focus. We also did a reach out on we'll be doing a reach out on EUDR. The one topic on here which I haven't mentioned is CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Maybe many of you have heard about this, maybe not. Basically, companies with significant size in Europe, 2025 for the biggest companies, 2026 for the next tier of companies, will have to issue a corporate sustainability report. So this is going to be really the first time that there is a uniform framework for companies to report their sustainability activities across many, many measures. So this is a kind of a landmark piece of legislation. And again, I know many companies are trying to put in place how they're going to tackle it, and that is why we had the seminars in the course of this year. So with that, I'm now going to hand over